Cairo, a city where ancient history and modern life intertwine. Beneath its sun-soaked streets and bustling markets, secrets have always lingered in the shadows. But few secrets have ever been as shocking, as deadly, as the story of Judge Fatima Hassan. Fatima Hassan wasn't just any judge. She was a symbol of progress, a woman breaking barriers in a world where tradition often holds sway. Respected, admired, even revered by some. Yet behind the polished courtroom facade, there was another Fatima. A woman entangled in a dangerous relationship with a man she should have feared, not loved. A man who, by her own hand, was sentenced to life in prison. But love, or perhaps obsession, knows no bounds. And when her secret life threatened to surface, the price of silence was blood. Her husband, Nelson Jones, a police captain dedicated to upholding the very laws Fatima presided over, found himself caught in a nightmare. A nightmare he never saw coming. A betrayal so profound it would cost him his life. This is the story of ambition, deception, and murder. A story that shook Cairo to its core and sent shockwaves far beyond the courtroom walls. How did a woman who once stood for justice find herself on the wrong side of the law? And what drove her to orchestrate the ultimate crime? Stay with us as we uncover the tangled threads of power, passion, and fatal decisions that led Judge Fatima Hassan from the heights of respectability to a fate sealed by her own courtroom gavel. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. To understand how Judge Fatima Hassan's life unraveled so completely, we must first trace the path that brought her to the pinnacle of Egyptian society, and the shadows that began to close in around her. Fatima Hassan's story begins in the crowded neighborhoods of Cairo, where ambition is a rare luxury for women of her generation. But Fatima was different. From a young age, she displayed a sharp mind and an unyielding determination to break through the constraints of tradition. In the early days of her legal career, Fatima made headlines. She wasn't just the first woman to sit on the bench in her region. She was a trailblazer in a judiciary long dominated by men. Her appointment wasn't merely a personal victory, it was seen as a monumental shift in Egypt's judicial landscape. Her presence in the courtroom symbolized a new era, one where women could hold positions of authority and shape the course of justice. She quickly gained a reputation as a no-nonsense judge. Her rulings were fair, her demeanor stern yet composed. She spoke out publicly about the need for reforms to protect women's rights, earning both praise and criticism in a deeply patriarchal society. But beneath the accolades and respect, there was another side to Fatima Hassan, one that few ever saw. A side shaped by personal loneliness and a craving for connection that would ultimately lead her down a dangerous path. Nelson Jones, her husband, seemed like the perfect match for such a formidable woman. A police captain, Nelson was known for his integrity and unshakable sense of duty. His commitment to law and order earned him the respect of his peers and the trust of his community. He had seen the darker sides of Cairo, the crime, the corruption, the desperation. Yet, despite the harsh realities of his job, Nelson believed in justice and the rule of law. Their marriage, at least on the surface, appeared solid. Two powerful figures, one in law enforcement, the other in the judiciary, seemingly united by their shared dedication to justice. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to form. While Nelson was preoccupied with his work, Fatima's emotional needs went unmet. It was in this void that a dangerous liaison took root. Enter Omar Abdul Rahman, a convicted murderer with a dark past. Sentenced to life in prison for a brutal killing, Omar was the kind of man Fatima had spent her career locking away. Yet somehow their paths crossed. Some say it was during one of her visits to the prison. Others whisper that their connection began long before his conviction. Omar was charismatic, manipulative, and cunning. He had a way of drawing people in, making them feel seen, understood. For a woman like Fatima, who carried the weight of societal expectations and personal isolation, Omar offered something she desperately craved: attention and understanding. Their affair began in secret. Letters exchanged in code, clandestine meetings arranged through intermediaries. Fatima knew the risks. She knew that if anyone discovered the truth, her career and reputation would be destroyed. But the thrill, the danger, it became intoxicating. Meanwhile, Cairo itself was undergoing its own transformation. The early 2000s saw a city grappling with political tensions, economic disparities, and cultural shifts. Women were fighting for more rights and visibility, but the pushback from conservative factions was fierce. For Fatima to hold her position was already a defiance of tradition. To be involved in an illicit affair? That was a scandal waiting to explode. The social fabric of Cairo was tightly woven with customs and expectations. Women in positions of power faced immense scrutiny. They were expected to uphold a standard of moral conduct that was often unrealistic and suffocating. Fatima's rise to prominence was seen as both a triumph and a threat, a woman who dared to claim a seat at the table in a male-dominated world. Her appointment as the first female judge in her region carried significant cultural implications. It was a statement of progress, but it also came with immense pressure. Fatima was expected to be a beacon of morality, an example for other women to follow. Any misstep would be magnified tenfold. The affair with Omar wasn't just a personal failing. It was a transgression that violated the very principles Fatima was sworn to uphold. It wasn't just about love or lust, it was about power, control, and the dangerous allure of forbidden connections. And then there was Nelson Jones, the unsuspecting husband. A man dedicated to his duty, blind to the storm brewing in his own home. His love for Fatima was genuine, but he could never have imagined the betrayal that awaited him. The stage was set. The players were in place. Cairo, with its ancient secrets and modern complexities, became the backdrop for a tragedy that would capture the attention of a nation. This is the story of how ambition, love, and deception collided in the life of Judge Fatima Hassan, and how a city's most respected judge became its most infamous criminal. The tale of Judge Fatima Hassan's rise to prominence is remarkable, but what followed is even more extraordinary, a story of forbidden desire, betrayal, and murder. The crime that would shake Cairo to its core began not with violence, but with a secret that Fatima fought desperately to keep hidden. It is said that love blinds, but in Fatima's case, it was something far more complex. Her affair with Omar Abdul Rahman didn't begin with romance. It began with a letter. A simple message sent from a prison cell to a judge's chambers, an appeal for clemency disguised as a thank you note. Omar's words were carefully chosen, laced with flattery and intrigue. He spoke of his remorse, his longing for redemption, and his admiration for the judge who had sentenced him. But between the lines there was something more, a subtle, magnetic pull that Fatima couldn't ignore. Their correspondence grew more frequent. What started as formal and professional quickly turned personal. Fatima found herself drawn to Omar's intelligence, his wit, and the way he seemed to understand her struggles. He wasn't just a convict, he became her confidant, someone who saw her not as a judge or a public figure, but as a woman. It wasn't long before letters turned into clandestine meetings. Fatima used her influence to arrange visits to the prison under the guise of official business. Each meeting carried immense risk. She knew that discovery would ruin her, yet she couldn't stop. The danger only seemed to heighten the allure. They met in the shadows of prison corridors, away from prying eyes. Their conversations were charged with tension and desire. Fatima, the respected judge, and Omar, the convicted murderer, two people from vastly different worlds, bound by a dangerous connection. Fatima went to great lengths to keep the affair hidden. She used intermediaries to deliver messages, paid off guards to turn a blind eye, and altered official documents to cover her tracks. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of coming to light. Nelson Jones was no ordinary man. As a police captain, he had spent years unraveling mysteries and exposing criminals. But nothing could have prepared him for the betrayal lurking within his own home. The first sign came in the form of intercepted letters. Nelson wasn't the type to snoop, but something about Fatima's behavior had changed. She was distant, distracted. Late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, small things that, on their own, might have been dismissed. But together they painted a troubling picture. One night, Nelson found a letter hidden in Fatima's study. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the language intimate. It didn't take long for him to piece together the truth. His wife, the woman he loved and respected, was having an affair with a man she had sentenced to life in prison. The confrontation was inevitable. Nelson confronted Fatima with the letter in hand. The argument that followed was explosive. Voices were raised, accusations hurled. Fatima, cornered, tried to deny it at first, but Nelson's evidence was undeniable. What was said in that heated exchange will never be fully known, but one thing is certain. Nelson threatened to expose her. He couldn't reconcile the woman he married with the betrayal she had committed. For Nelson, the law was absolute, and Fatima had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. Faced with the collapse of her career, her reputation, and her marriage, Fatima made a choice. Desperation led her to consider the unthinkable. If Nelson were gone, her secret would be safe. Her life, her career, could continue untainted. She reached out to one of Omar's contacts, a man with a reputation for handling problems discreetly. A hitman. The arrangement was simple. Nelson Jones had to die. The plan was meticulously crafted. Fatima knew Nelson's routines, his habits. She knew when he would be most vulnerable. The hitman was instructed to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence in a city where crime was not uncommon. On a quiet evening, Nelson was returning home from work. The streets of Cairo were alive with the usual hustle and bustle, but in the shadows, the hitman waited. As Nelson stepped out of his car, the assailant struck. A single gunshot echoed through the night, piercing the air and shattering the quiet. Nelson Jones lay bleeding on the pavement, his life slipping away. The hitman fled into the night, leaving behind a scene that, at first glance, appeared to be a tragic accident. But the aftermath was anything but simple. Fatima's grief was convincing. She played the part of a devastated widow, mourning the loss of her husband. She attended the funeral in tears, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and the community that once revered her. Yet, behind closed doors, Fatima was scrambling to cover her tracks. She destroyed letters, wiped her phone clean, and distanced herself from Omar and the hitman. But the threads of her deception were already beginning to unravel. The investigation into Nelson's murder would soon reveal inconsistencies, details that didn't add up. And as the truth began to surface, Cairo would be gripped by a scandal that no one could have foreseen. In the early morning hours following the murder of Captain Nelson Jones, Cairo woke to the chilling news of his death. It wasn't just the murder of a police captain that shocked the city, it was the brutal, cold-blooded manner in which it happened. For a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, his end came with a violent irony that left the entire community reeling. It was a passerby who first stumbled upon Nelson's body. The street was quiet, save for the distant sounds of Cairo coming to life with the dawn. Nelson lay on the pavement, his blood pooling beneath him, a stark contrast against the dusty street. The initial assumption was that it was a robbery gone wrong. The area where Nelson was found had seen its share of petty crimes. His wallet was missing and his watch was gone. It appeared to be an unfortunate but not uncommon occurrence in a city where desperation often drove people to violence. But as investigators arrived on the scene, something didn't sit right. The precision of the attack, the single gunshot wound, suggested something more calculated. This wasn't the chaotic work of a desperate thief. It was deliberate, methodical. Nelson's colleagues in the police force took his death personally. They vowed to find whoever was responsible no matter how long it took. What they didn't yet realize was that the answers they sought would lead them to a place they never expected. A courtroom presided over by a judge they all respected. The investigation began with the collection of forensic evidence from the crime scene. Bullet casings, footprints, and tire marks were meticulously catalogued. The autopsy confirmed what investigators had suspected. Nelson was killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range. The forensic team found traces of gunpowder residue on Nelson's clothing, indicating that the shooter had been standing very close when the shot was fired. This wasn't a random, distant shot, it was personal. As the investigation progressed, detectives began reviewing Nelson's case files and his recent activities. Was this murder connected to his work? Had he made enemies within the criminal underworld? These were the questions they sought to answer. Initially, suspicion fell on known criminals whom Nelson had investigated or arrested. Several individuals with violent pasts were brought in for questioning. But as the days turned into weeks, no concrete leads emerged. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Nelson's phone records. Investigators discovered a series of calls between Nelson and his wife, Fatima Hassan, on the day of his murder. The conversation seemed tense, the tone clipped. One message in particular stood out, a voicemail from Nelson to Fatima, left just hours before his death. "We need to talk. I know everything." At first, Fatima was seen as a grieving widow. Her tears at Nelson's funeral had seemed genuine, her sorrow palpable. But as investigators dug deeper, her name began to surface in ways that couldn't be ignored. Detectives learned of Fatima's clandestine visits to the prison where Omar Abdul Rahman was incarcerated. These visits were not part of her official duties as a judge. They were personal. When questioned, Fatima claimed that her visits were part of a rehabilitation initiative. But the frequency of her visits and the nature of their communication raised red flags. Investigators began to piece together a timeline that suggested a much deeper connection between Fatima and Omar, a connection that Nelson had uncovered. As suspicions mounted, detectives decided to follow the money. Financial records revealed unusual transactions from Fatima's accounts. Large sums of money withdrawn in cash, with no clear explanation. Surveillance footage from an ATM showed Fatima making these withdrawals herself, always looking over her shoulder, always nervous. The focus of the investigation shifted. Fatima was no longer just a grieving widow, she was a person of interest. And as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a web of deception and betrayal that led straight to her doorstep. News of Nelson's murder spread quickly, and the public was horrified. The idea that a police captain could be gunned down in the streets of Cairo struck fear into the hearts of many. But when rumors began to circulate about Fatima's possible involvement, the shock turned to disbelief. Fatima Hassan was a respected figure, a symbol of progress and justice. The idea that she could be involved in such a heinous crime was unthinkable to many. The media seized on the story, and headlines blared with sensational accusations. Judge or killer? The dark secret of Cairo's first female judge. The courtroom that Fatima had once presided over became a place of scrutiny. Every decision she had ever made was called into question. Her colleagues, her peers, and even her supporters began to distance themselves from her. But amidst the media frenzy, there were those who couldn't believe the allegations. Some argued that Fatima was being framed, that she was a victim of a misogynistic system that couldn't handle a woman in power. Others pointed to her impeccable record, her advocacy for women's rights, and her dedication to justice as evidence that she couldn't possibly be guilty. Yet, as the investigation continued, the evidence against her grew stronger. The community that had once admired her was now divided. Was she a symbol of progress who had been unjustly targeted? Or was she a manipulative woman who had orchestrated the murder of her own husband to protect her darkest secret? The answer would soon be revealed in a courtroom that Fatima knew all too well, a place where justice would be sought, not by her hand but against her. As the investigation drew to a close, the evidence against Judge Fatima Hassan was overwhelming. Her reputation as a symbol of justice and progress was now overshadowed by allegations of conspiracy and murder. The courtroom, once a place where Fatima presided over cases, would now become the stage for her own trial, a spectacle that gripped the nation. On the day of her arrest, Fatima stood stoic, her face betraying no emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. The charges brought against her were severe: conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a woman who had used her influence to orchestrate the murder of her husband. The indictment laid out the chilling details. Fatima was accused of hiring a hitman to kill Nelson Jones, manipulating official records to cover her tracks, and maintaining a secret relationship with Omar Abdul Rahman, a convicted murderer. The prosecution argued that Fatima's actions were driven by a desperate need to protect her secret affair and preserve her public image. As the charges were read in court, the gallery was packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and members of the legal community who had once admired Fatima. The air was thick with tension as the trial began. The trial itself was a spectacle unlike any Cairo had seen in years. Key testimonies would make or break the case, and the prosecution wasted no time in calling their star witness, the hitman. Dressed in a prison uniform, the hitman took the stand. His testimony was chilling. He described in detail how he was approached by Omar Abdul Rahman, acting on Fatima's instructions to carry out the murder. He recounted the planning, the payment he received, and the precise instructions to make the murder look like a robbery. She wanted it done quickly and cleanly, the hitman testified. She said it was the only way to protect her career. The courtroom was silent as the hitman described the fateful night. He spoke of waiting in the shadows, watching Nelson Jones step out of his car and pulling the trigger. The prosecution played surveillance footage showing the hitman near the scene of the crime, further corroborating his story. Next, the prosecution called Omar Abdul Rahman to the stand. His testimony was equally damning. He admitted to the affair with Fatima and detailed their clandestine meetings. He confessed to acting as the intermediary between Fatima and the hitman, painting a picture of a judge who had crossed every ethical boundary. "She told me she couldn't let her husband ruin her," Omar stated. "She said she had worked too hard to let it all fall apart." The defense team faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was to discredit the witnesses and cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They argued that the hitman and Omar had motives to lie, both seeking reduced sentences in exchange for their testimonies. Fatima's defense lawyer painted her as a victim of manipulation. They suggested that Omar had orchestrated the murder without her knowledge, hoping to eliminate Nelson and secure a future with Fatima. The defense argued that Fatima's only crime was poor judgment and trusting the wrong people. But the evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, financial transactions, and letters between Fatima and Omar all pointed to her direct involvement in the plot. The prosecution presented a damning timeline, showing how Fatima's actions aligned perfectly with the murder. As the trial unfolded, the media played a significant role in shaping public perception. Sensational headlines splashed across newspapers and television screens. The fall of Cairo's first female judge. Love, power, and murder. The Fatima Hassan scandal. Journalists dissected every detail of the case, turning Fatima's life into a public spectacle. Opinion pieces debated whether she was a victim of her circumstances or a cunning criminal who had abused her power. The public fascination with the case was immense. People gathered outside the courthouse, eager for updates. Social media buzzed with discussions, theories, and debates about Fatima's guilt. Some saw her as a tragic figure, while others condemned her as a symbol of corruption. The media frenzy added pressure on the legal teams and the court. Every move, every word spoken in the courtroom was scrutinized and broadcast to the world. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and cross-examinations, the trial reached its conclusion. The judge presiding over the case delivered the verdict with a solemn expression. In the matter of the state versus Fatima Hassan, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted in a mix of gasps, whispers, and murmurs. The judge continued, outlining the court's reasoning and the evidence that led to the guilty verdict. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom fell silent once more. The judge's voice was firm, unwavering. For the crime of conspiracy to commit murder, and for the abuse of power in the course of your duties as a judge, this court sentences you to death. Fatima Hassan, the woman who had once been a beacon of hope and progress, stood motionless as the sentence was read. Her face remained stoic, betraying no emotion. But those closest to her would later say that in that moment, they saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or resignation. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters clamored for a statement. But Fatima said nothing. She kept her head high, her silence speaking volumes. The reaction to the verdict was swift and divided. Some praised the justice system for holding even the most powerful accountable. Others mourned the fall of a woman who had once been a symbol of progress. But one thing was certain. The trial of Fatima Hassan would be remembered for years to come, not just for the crime itself, but for the questions it raised about power, corruption, and the human cost of ambition. The murder of Fatima Hassan shook Cairo to its very core. In a city known for its complex social dynamics and rich history, this tragedy highlighted the fragility of trust in its institutions. The brutal nature of the crime, especially the cold, calculated betrayal involving a figure as seemingly unassuming as Fatima, left the city in a state of disbelief. Fatima's once prominent family, who had long been pillars of the community, now faced public condemnation and isolation, as their personal tragedies became fodder for gossip, speculation, and public outcry. The crime's fallout extended far beyond the family. The murder became a symbol of how power, wealth, and influence in Cairo could corrupt even the most trusted institutions. 4 weeks after the incident, Cairo's streets were filled with whispers about the involvement of prominent figures. Many speculated that the police investigation itself was being manipulated by high-ranking officials, further fueling public distrust. Cairo's judicial system, already under scrutiny for corruption and inefficiency, found itself under intense pressure. The case attracted widespread media attention, as journalists from across the country descended on the city. The public demanded answers, but it quickly became clear that the very institutions that were supposed to bring justice were compromised. With rumors of bribery and political influence swirling, the case was delayed for months, leading to widespread protests. Citizens took to the streets, chanting slogans demanding reform and justice, not just for Fatima but for the entire nation. As the judicial system failed to deliver a swift resolution, many citizens began to question the integrity of law enforcement. Was Fatima's case just one example of a much larger issue within Cairo's legal system? Or was it an isolated incident, exacerbated by a series of unfortunate events? Either way, the loss of trust in the community was undeniable. People started to feel like the law could no longer be trusted to protect them from the forces of corruption and betrayal lurking in their own cities. In the aftermath of Fatima's murder, the public outcry reached such a level that it forced the government to take action. The case became a turning point in Cairo's legal history, marking the beginning of much-needed reforms. The revelations surrounding the case and the apparent failure of the judicial system triggered an overhaul in the way criminal investigations were conducted. One of the first major changes was the implementation of independent oversight in high-profile cases, ensuring that police investigations were no longer subject to the whims of powerful elites. New anti-corruption measures were introduced, aiming to address the root causes of the public's mistrust in the system. Special task forces were established to investigate corruption within law enforcement and the judiciary, and new protocols were enacted to ensure that cases like Fatima's could no longer be swept under the rug. Additionally, legal professionals and human rights groups pushed for changes to the country's laws concerning accountability for political figures and the wealthy elite. They lobbied for more transparency in judicial proceedings and called for a shift towards a more equitable and just legal system that would not be so easily manipulated by those in power. Though it would take years for these reforms to fully take root, Fatima's case undoubtedly left its mark, pushing Cairo, and Egypt as a whole, towards greater legal accountability. As the case continued to unfold, the fates of the key figures involved in Fatima's death became even more unsettling. The investigation revealed that Fatima's lover, Ahmed, had a troubling history, one that suggested a deeper involvement in the crime than anyone had previously imagined. While his initial testimony claimed that he had been unaware of the plot to kill Fatima, evidence began to surface that contradicted his claims. Financial transactions, phone records, and eyewitness accounts suggested that Ahmed had been in constant contact with the hired hitman long before the murder took place. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Ahmed finally admitted to his role in orchestrating the crime. He had been deeply in debt, his business dealings under the control of shadowy figures within Cairo's criminal underworld. In exchange for financial freedom, he had agreed to Fatima's murder. But what was truly chilling was the revelation that Fatima's death was part of a much larger scheme involving powerful political figures and businessmen, all of whom stood to benefit from her demise. As for Fatima's family, their lives were turned upside down. The scandal surrounding her murder revealed secrets about their own involvement with corruption and criminal organizations that shocked the public. They had long been suspected of underhanded dealings, but the case shed light. Fatima's murder serves as a chilling reminder of the corrupting influence of power and love. In this case, both forces collided, leading to a catastrophic series of decisions. What began as a personal betrayal evolved into a complex web of criminal activity involving wealthy elites, political figures, and a compromised judicial system. It's a stark illustration of how love can blind individuals to moral boundaries and drive them to commit acts they would never have imagined. And power, whether in the form of wealth, influence, or control, can manipulate and destroy lives in unimaginable ways. At the heart of this case lies a fundamental truth. Those who hold power are not immune to the same flaws and weaknesses as anyone else. Even the most respected figures, like the judge involved in the scandal, can fall victim to their desires and ambitions, risking everything in the pursuit of personal gain or forbidden love. Fatima's tragic end became the mirror reflecting the moral decay that can infect even the most seemingly unbreakable institutions. What would drive a respected judge to risk everything for a forbidden love? Could this case have been prevented? Was there a moment when one small choice could have changed the entire trajectory of the story? These questions leave us pondering the true cost of corruption, passion, and moral compromise. How often do we overlook the signs of deep moral conflict, especially in those we trust the most? What are your thoughts on this shocking case? Was justice truly served? Could there have been more to the story than what we know? Let us know in the comments. If you found this deep dive into the dark side of human nature compelling, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories. Stay tuned for our next investigation into the secrets that hide in plain sight.